Imagine, if you will, an alternate dimension. A universe where the PSP we all know and love was not Sony's first foray into handheld gaming, but rather a second-generation marvel. In this strange reality, an elusive predecessor emerged during the reign of the original PlayStation. A handheld shrouded in mystery, long lost to time. Or was it? Tonight, we step beyond the veil and peer into this rare interdimensional realm. Join me as we uncover the secrets of a portable that might have been. The PlayStation Phantom. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito, and welcome to a very special Halloween episode of Retro Renew. Today, I am super excited to share with you a project that I've been working on for the past few months. This here is what I'm calling the PlayStation Phantom. Why the name Phantom? Well, because it never existed. But it could have. This manifestation of a portable gaming device has some serious OG PlayStation vibes. And if it looks familiar to you, that's probably because you either follow a very talented creator named Hiro Sato, who goes by HiHiSB on Instagram, or you may have seen articles covering his really cool build. Either way, as soon as I saw it, I just knew I had to make one. But as you all know, I lack the necessary PCB design skills and 3D design skills to pull something like this off. I basically just know how to follow instructions and how to solder things, which is why I enlisted the help of a longtime friend of the channel, Kyle from Brinkeroff Systems. I floated the idea to him of making one of these, and before I could even finish pitching him, he agreed. So we hit the ground running, asking ourselves, how on earth are we going to bring this thing to life? Well, thankfully there are quite a few photos and videos of this on Hiro's Instagram account, so we carefully inspected each one, taking notes. Now, at the heart of this entire mod is the Takara Roulette controller, which was released in 2001, specifically made for the game of life for the original PlayStation. This controller essentially provides the bounds of the project, meaning everything needs to be contained within the shell. So to do this, we decided early on that we would use a Raspberry Pi Zero 2 for this, and in order to maintain the form factor and all of the original button functionality, a custom PCB would need to be designed. There also needed to be a headphone jack at the top from where the controller cord is located, not only because it seemed like the logical place to have one, but also that's what Hiro's design had as well. Additionally, we wanted this project to be completely open source, so if someone wanted to pick this up later and refine it, they could. So we put all the Gerber and 3D printing files along with the bill of material on Kyle's GitHub. Now, in order to help with the design of the PCB, Kyle also began 3D modeling the shell. This is great because not only did it help us design the PCB, but it can also be used in the future to 3D print and use instead of sacrificing these pretty rare controllers. Anyway, as Kyle began designing the PCB, we quickly realized that the space within the shell is pretty limited. So given this constraint, as well as the accelerated schedule of the project, we had to make a few sacrifices. Two of the larger ones being the screen size and the battery capacity. For the screen, we had originally wanted to use one of these really cool circle-shaped ones since we thought it would just look absolutely amazing in the shell, but quickly realized that it wasn't feasible. So we ended up using this one, which was smaller than we wanted, but ended up working nicely, again given the timeline of this project and being well documented online. As for the battery, Kyle found these 300 mAh ones that fit nicely into these recessed areas here, but at 300 mAh, their capacity is absurdly small, Just for context, the typical lithium-ion batteries that we use for Game Boy Power mods are around 1800 mAh, or roughly 6 times more than this tiny one. Anyway, we'll get more into this issue a bit later on in the video. Additionally, again to save time, Kyle utilized existing off-the-shelf components so that we didn't have to waste time designing our own and integrating them. One such item is the USB-C charging circuit, which we would use to charge the battery when needed. So, given all these parts, Kyle got to work designing the PCB and came up with this absolute masterpiece. Again, Kyle made this in literally about a month and honestly just knocked it out of the park. Now, the last piece we needed was a screen lens to really tie the whole build together. I reached out to another friend named Jason who has a nice designing outfit called Tecton Concepts, and he produced this beautiful PlayStation branded acrylic lens using his really fancy laser cutter. These came out looking absolutely fabulous. Throughout the design process, Kyle meticulously refined the main PCB, making multiple iterations to ensure everything was just right. PCBWay played a crucial role in this journey by providing the boards that helped us prototype the PlayStation Phantom every step of the way. So I have to give a huge thank you to PCBWay for providing the boards for this project and for being the sponsor of today's video. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, so now that we have a sense of all the parts that we're using for the PlayStation Phantom, as well as how it was kind of designed, let me show you how to put it all together. Alright, so we're actually going to start this build off by first assembling the custom motherboard. And the first thing we're going to do is install the multi-function momentary switch, which is primarily for adjusting the console's volume, but will also be used to access the in-game menu. Alright, next we'll drop in the USB-C charging circuit, which will be used to both power the console as well as charge the internal lithium-ion battery. This is actually a very common off-the-shelf board that I've used in quite a few of my other videos. It saved Kyle the trouble of having to design and integrate his own power circuit. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and install some diodes. These were mainly used during the troubleshooting phase of the project and are essentially remnants of that process. Over here, I'll be installing the cable for connecting the LCD display. I had to cut the wires quite a bit shorter to help save some space inside of the shell, since it's going to be pretty cramped in there as is. So these two connectors here are actually for two separate speakers. The original idea we had was to have stereo sound, but again, due to the timing constraints of this project, the Phantom only supports mono audio. Additionally, the speaker that I'm using doesn't come with a JST connector, so instead I'm going to be removing the connector and solder in the speaker directly to the pads. Next, we're going to go ahead and solder in the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 compute module. Pro tip, I found that it's way easier to install it if you pre-tin the pads on the motherboard first. Here you can see that I'm adding some VHB double-sided tape to the LCD driver board, but this isn't for sticking the LCD panel to the motherboard. This is instead to help provide even spacing of the panel to the motherboard, since there is some surface-mounted components sticking out from the LCD driver board that would cause it to lay unevenly. I also had to trim a bit here in the top right corner of the driver board in order to help with fitment into the front shell housing. Now we can go ahead and connect the LCD to the motherboard. I had to use some pliers as the connector is pretty tight. And the LCD is secured to the motherboard using 3 screws that thread directly into the motherboard PCB. It's not ideal, but it works. Then, again, using some VHB double-sided tape, I can go ahead and secure the speaker. Now here, I'm installing a jumper cable, which essentially helps amplify the audio coming from the speaker. This basically connects the negative audio input to ground, helping improve overall audio. Next, I'm soldering in the power switch, which I bent at a 90-degree angle. And lastly, I'm installing a LED power indicator, which illuminates when the console is turned on. Okay, so the motherboard is basically fully assembled. To test everything out, I connect a battery to the power board and installed my SD card with Kyle's custom OS flash to it, just to test everything out and make sure everything is working properly. And we can see that Emulation Station boots right up, which means we're good to go. Now comes the hard part, which is trimming the shell. Before we can do that though, we first need to tear it down. Okay, so we'll first tackle the front shell by routing out all this material inside the circle. For this, I'll be using my Dremel attached to my drill press accessory. Before proceeding, however, I taped off the inner rim of the circle to help protect it from getting marred by accident when using the router bit. I also taped the shell to some cardboard, which should help me maneuver it while routing out the material. Also, do not forget to wear eye protection if you're going to be using a setup like this. Nice, this actually came out looking pretty good. Don't worry if it isn't perfect, as the bezel and lens will cover pretty much all of it up. Next, I'm going to temporarily place the motherboard into the front shell to mark the areas that I need to trim so that I can access all of the various I/O as well as the volume rocker. I pretty much used a small jeweler's file for most of this, as the plastic is pretty soft. This is the part of the build that will take the most time and effort, so go slow, be patient, and check your work often. Once you're happy with the cutouts, we'll need to remove a few of the internal posts as shown here. Now, this thing here is a 3D printed jig that Kyle designed, which will help us drill out the speaker grill in the rear shell. In order for this to work, you need to fasten the 2 halves of the shell together and then insert the jig into the newly cut out circle as shown. Then make sure to choose the drill bit that fits into these holes and then drill away. Fantastic, now that the shell is pretty much completely trimmed, give it one last test fit to make sure everything looks good. I'm pretty happy with the results, so we can go ahead and proceed to the final part of the build. The wires on the battery are actually a bit too short, so we do need to extend them before we can install it. Once that's done, we can now begin final assembly. With some double-sided tape, I'm going to go ahead and stick the battery into this small recess in the right part of the rear shell. And then I'll solder the wires to the input terminals on the power board. And before we button the Phantom up, go ahead and install the SD card into the Pi. Great, we're almost done. I just wanted to give it one last test before we wrap this up. The last thing that we need to do is install the LCD bezel bracket and the beautiful screen lens, both of which I'll be securing using double-sided tape. And there you have it, folks. The PlayStation Phantom fully assembled. Man, this honestly came out looking so awesome. It's not exactly like Hyro's version, but it's pretty close. Kyle even made a slightly modified skin for Emulation Station that looks reminiscent of the original PlayStation's boot menu, giving the build a convincing retro vibe straight out of the 90s. And he also mapped all the buttons so that it works out the gate like one would expect. You can actually download this custom OS build, which again is available in Kyle's GitHub. Anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so why don't I just take you around the PlayStation Phantom and show you some of its unique features. Overall, this really isn't anything too special, as it's essentially a Raspberry Pi emulation handheld, but it's worth taking a closer look at some notable items. So starting at the bottom, we have all of the I/O from the Pi Zero accessible through the cutouts in the shell, which technically allows us to output video over HDMI, and we can also power the unit through one of the two USB micro ports. And lastly, we have the physical power switch here all the way on the left. Over here on the side, we have the volume rocker, which can adjust the volume by swiping up or down, with an additional function by pressing the rocker switch in. Doing this allows us to enter the in-game menu during gameplay so that we can exit games and go back to the RetroPie menu, or change the game settings, which can be pretty handy. Around top, we have the 3.5mm headphone jack, obviously for using headphones, and on the other side, we have the USB-C port for charging our tiny internal battery. And speaking of which, we can get about 15 whole minutes of gameplay. Yeah, this pretty much makes the handheld completely impractical. We'll definitely be discussing this shortcoming a bit later in the video, as it's definitely one of the major weaknesses of the project. And of course here front and center, we have the 2.4-inch screen, which despite its small size, does output a pretty nice image. It uses an SPI interface, and the games scale pretty much perfectly. There are, however, a few issues that I have with this particular display, but again, we'll dive into that in just a moment. We were of course able to utilize the original membrane buttons, and Kyle actually pre-configured Emulation Station to map all of these buttons so that they work as they should. Around back, we have the speaker grill, with the audio output being just okay and a bit on the low side, but at the end of the day, it does work. On the other hand, the audio from the headphone jack is actually very nice and would be my preference if I had to choose between the two. And lastly, since it is an emulation handheld, it can of course play games from consoles other than the PlayStation. Okay, so we know what the Phantom can do, but now let's get into the pros and cons. And starting with the pros, there's really only one, and it's the looks. I think most people can agree that this looks pretty awesome. It has this sort of wacky 90s flair that I think can certainly pass as some sort of concept that Sony may have cooked up back in the day. But honestly, beyond the facade, there really isn't much there. At its core, it's essentially a Raspberry Pi emulation handheld, and an average one at that, with some pretty glaring drawbacks. Looks can only get you so far, and in this case, they're primarily skin deep, which brings me to the cons. Again, we have to remember that this was done under a pretty tight time crunch, and if properly planned with more time for development, we could have built a more usable device. This isn't by any measure a knock on Kyle's work, which, let's be honest, is incredible given the very quick turnaround time of this project. I'm really astonished at what he was able to accomplish, and I definitely have to give him a huge thank you for all the work he did here. Anyway, the cons are pretty obvious, with two really standout ones, the first one being battery life, and the second one being the button configuration. Let's start with the battery life. We literally only have a single 300 mAh battery powering this whole device and get about 15 minutes of gameplay. Not practical by any measure. There are several things we could have done to increase the battery life, like sticking another 300 mAh battery in the other cavity. This is something that I would have done, but unfortunately the LCD cables here are all bunched up and kind of occupy that space, so it wasn't really feasible. Another thing we could have done is use a smaller speaker and put it somewhere else inside the console, and then put a larger battery in this entire space here. Or if we had more time, we could have put a spacer in between the two halves to give us more internal volume. Regardless, the battery life is less than ideal, and it definitely requires improvement. Alright, now as for the button configuration, I'm not sure if you noticed, but the 4 trigger buttons are no longer trigger buttons at all, and instead are located here on the front of the console. This essentially makes games that extensively use triggers, like Resident Evil here, pretty much impossible to play. This again could have easily been fixed if we had more time by placing triggers on the back of the console where they belong. Anyway, those to me are the most glaring issues that kind of need to be addressed in order to make this a more viable gaming handheld. There are also quite a few other more quality of life issues that we would love to fix if we were to do another iteration. This includes things like the volume, which is a bit low. However, the audio coming from the headphones, like I mentioned earlier, actually sounds pretty decent, but the external speakers could certainly use a boost. Additionally, the screen is a bit small. The circular opening can definitely fit a larger display, but maybe finding a compatible circular LCD to fit in there would be really neat and utilize the space a lot better. Also, the viewing angles are pretty bad, especially when looking at the screen from the left. My guess is the screen is meant to be oriented vertically, since the top and bottom viewing angles aren't that bad at all. And lastly, the physical power switch on the bottom doesn't run a safe shutdown script, so you will need to shut down the console within RetroPie, and once that sequence is complete, you'll have to power everything down by switching the physical switch. If you don't, the screen will remain on and eventually kill the battery. Now, with all that being said, let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. The PlayStation Phantom isn't just a custom build, it's really an experiment, a way to reimagine history and explore what could have been. At the end of the day, this was a fun project and a great learning experience. And while it was never really intended to be a practical gaming device, seeing it all come together was rewarding in and of itself. I want to give a huge thank you to Kyle for all of his help with this build, as it would have not been possible at all without his help. I also want to thank Jason for his awesome screen lens, and of course Hyro for coming up with this very cool concept that inspired this video. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, have a happy and safe Halloween, and I'll see you next time.